He didn't even know what he was looking at. David stepped out of his car and time stopped. There, on the icy ground near the front gate, was a boy, thin, barely dressed, arms wrapped around someone. And then he saw her face, his mother, barefoot, cold, slumped in the boy's arms like a child, her silver hair tangled, her lips turning blue, and around both of them, a small blanket, damp and fraying, too thin to save anyone. David didn't think. He just ran, slipped on the driveway, cried out her name. His breath caught in his throat as he dropped to his knees. "Mom?" The boy looked up. His voice was barely more than a whisper. She was shaking. She didn't know where she was. I couldn't leave her. And then he passed out. That's when David felt something break inside of him. David Scott was a billionaire, CEO, powerhouse, feared in every boardroom from London to New York. But that morning, as he held his unconscious mother in one arm and a homeless teenage boy in the other, none of it mattered. Not the mansion behind him, not the empire he'd built, not the money, the titles, the life he thought was secure. All that remained was a question. How did this happen? How did a boy with nothing risk everything to save the one person David should have protected? How did a stranger in the snow end up doing what a son could not? And why did it feel like God had sent him? Before we begin this story, please pause for just a moment. If you've ever felt forgotten, if you've ever questioned where God was in the middle of your storm, or if you've ever seen love show up in the most unexpected place, then this story is for you. Click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Because sometimes God sends angels in rags, and sometimes they're the ones who save us. The ambulance lights hadn't arrived yet. There was only the sound of wind, thick, sharp, and bitter against David's skin. He couldn't stop shaking, not from the cold, but from the sight of it. His mother's feet were purple, not bruised, frozen. Her nightgown was stuck to her legs, the hem caked in frost. She wasn't moving except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest, barely breathing. And this boy, this stranger, was still wrapped around her, as if protecting her from a world that had already taken too much. David's knees hit the ground with a thud. His hand reached for her wrist, ice cold, but her pulse was there. Faint. The boy didn't speak. He couldn't. His head drooped against Margaret's shoulder, lips cracked, eyes half closed. His breath came in stutters, every exhale a silent cry for help. David had no idea who he was, but something about the way the boy held her, gentle, desperate, made David's heart twist in ways he didn't understand yet. He tore off his coat and wrapped it around both of them. Then he reached for his phone, fingers trembling, voice unsteady. "Emergency. 2 people. Hypothermia. My mother, a teenage boy. Send someone now, please." The call ended. Seconds passed like hours. He tried to lift his mother, but her limbs were stiff. So he stayed on the ground, one arm around her, one arm around the boy. And somewhere between the silence and the snow, David began to pray. He hadn't prayed in years, not since his father's funeral, not since he stopped believing that God still paid attention to people like him, people who chose money over meaning, deals over dinners, success over family. But now none of that mattered. He whispered it like a confession. "God, please don't take her, not like this." The boy let out a soft groan, almost inaudible. David leaned closer. "She was lost," the boy rasped. She didn't know where she was. His words cracked like glass. "I couldn't leave her." And just like that, he went still. David caught him, lowering him gently onto the snow. The boy's fingers were still curled around Margaret's blanket. So old, so thin, it looked more like a memory than a piece of fabric. David looked at it closely. A faded flower stitched into one corner. Hand-sewn, a mother's stitch. That's when something pierced his chest, not fear. Guilt. He'd hired security, cameras, a care team. He paid for everything to keep her safe. Except his own presence. Except the one thing she needed most. His face fell into his hands. "Mom," he whispered, broken. A sound came from the driveway. Sirens. Blue and red light flickered across the snowbanks, painting shadows across the stone pillars of the gate. David stood as the paramedics jumped out. They didn't ask questions, they could see it in the boy's face, the woman's skin, the blanket between them. They moved quickly, wrapping his mother in warming sheets, checking vitals, lifting her onto the stretcher. Then came the boy. "He's colder than she is," one of them said. They placed him on a second stretcher. David followed them both, not thinking. He opened the back of the ambulance and climbed in, one hand on his mother's arm, one hand resting over the boy's chest. He didn't know who he was, didn't know where he came from, but something deep inside told him this wasn't a random act of kindness. This was something else. Maybe it was grace, maybe it was judgment, maybe it was God finally getting his attention. The doors shut. The ambulance drove off, and in the quiet hum of that ride, as snow tapped gently against the windows, David Scott sat between two lives he had never imagined would be connected, the mother who gave him everything, and a boy who had nothing, but gave her back to him. He bowed his head again, not from shame, but from a holy kind of awe, the kind that tells you, your life is about to change forever. Christopher hadn't spoken again, but his silence said enough. And as the ambulance sped toward the hospital, David's mind wasn't on meetings, it wasn't on money. It was on a question he couldn't stop hearing. Who is he? And somehow, he already knew. This boy wasn't here by accident. The wind cut through the alley like a blade. Christopher pulled his mother's blanket tighter around his shoulders, though the truth was it hadn't held in warmth for years. It just reminded him of her. The fabric was thin now, patched in two corners, with the smell of old soap still clinging to it. He hadn't slept. There wasn't anywhere safe to. Not really. Not when your last roof was a broken-down boarding house and your name wasn't on any lease. He'd been evicted that morning. Quietly. Without a scene. Just a soft apology from the landlord who'd looked tired of feeling sorry for him. "I gave you a few extra days, kid, but I've got a business to run." Christopher didn't argue. He just nodded, took the few things he owned, a backpack, a water bottle, 2 shirts and that old blanket, and stepped out into the cold. The sun was still low in the sky then, the kind of December morning where the cold settles into your bones before you've even taken your first step. He walked for hours, hands deep in his pockets, hood pulled low. He passed diners where people were laughing over pancakes, walked by warm houses with wreaths in the windows. He saw fathers helping their kids build snowmen, steam rising from mugs on porches. He didn't hate them. He didn't feel envy. Mostly, he felt invisible. At one point, his stomach cramped from hunger. He reached into his pocket and felt the last 2 bills he had, $3, wadded and damp from the snow. He could have gone to a fast food place, but he didn't want to sit there under fluorescent lights pretending to belong. So he kept walking. His path took him into one of the wealthier neighborhoods on the edge of town. Big stone houses, electric gates, driveways longer than some streets. He didn't mean to end up there. He just followed the quiet. And then he heard something, a sound carried faintly on the wind, crying, fragile, frightened. He stopped. It came again, a woman's voice, lost, disoriented. He followed it down a narrow path between 2 hedges toward the side gate of a large estate. And there she was, an elderly woman, standing in the snow. Her nightgown clung to her thin frame. Her hands trembled around a photo frame. The glass cracked. She was barefoot. "Ma'am?" Christopher called out gently. She didn't respond, just looked past him like she wasn't fully there. "I have to catch the train," she whispered. "James is waiting. I'm late." Her eyes were cloudy, darting left and right, searching a world only she could see. Christopher moved slowly toward her, keeping his voice low. "What's your name?" "Margaret," she said after a pause. "I think." He stepped closer. She didn't flinch, but she looked so small, so fragile, like the wrong gust of wind might blow her over. "You're cold," he said softly. "Let me help you." She nodded, almost like a child being told it was time to go home. He took off his jacket and draped it around her shoulders. Then he unwrapped the blanket from his own body and held it over both of them. "Where do you live, Margaret?" She looked around, lost. "Somewhere close, I think. But it doesn't feel right. Nothing feels right." He thought about calling someone. But who? He had no phone. And even if he did, he'd learned the hard way that people like him didn't get the benefit of the doubt. A black teenager with no address and no ID, found alone with an elderly white woman who couldn't explain who he was. That didn't end well. Ever. He couldn't risk the police. But he also couldn't leave her. So he did the only thing that felt right. He stayed. He helped her walk to a small alcove near the front gate. Stone walls on 3 sides, just enough to block the wind. He sat down first, then helped her sit beside him. He wrapped the blanket around their shoulders and held her close, trying to give her what warmth he could. For hours they sat like that, huddled together, breathing into the cold. He told her stories about his mum, how she used to make pancakes on Sunday mornings, how she'd sing while washing dishes, off-key but full of joy, how she used to say, "Being poor ain't the worst thing. Being cruel is." Margaret didn't always respond, but sometimes she smiled. And just before her eyes began to close, she whispered, "You're good. Your mother would be proud." Christopher swallowed hard. "I promised her I'd stay kind," he said quietly, "even when the world wasn't." He tightened the blanket around her shoulders, and then he closed his eyes. Not because he was tired, but because there was nothing else he could do, except stay. Snow fell quietly around them, covering the blanket, the alcove, the photo frame in her hands. And in the silence between them, something holy was happening, though no one else saw it yet. God had already begun the rescue. The snow didn't stop. It fell heavy now, thick and fast, brushing against Christopher's face like icy fingers. He blinked it away, but his eyelashes were starting to freeze. Margaret had stopped speaking. She was curled against him in the alcove, her body growing stiller by the minute, her breath shallow, her hands limp. He'd wrapped the blanket around both of them as tightly as he could, tucking it under her legs, under her back. Still, she shivered. He'd never been this cold before, not even on the nights he'd slept behind church buildings or in alleyways between dumpsters. Not even when he'd spent a week on the roof of a bus stop, trying to stay off the streets after the shelter closed down. This was different, because now it wasn't just his body shutting down, it was hers. He leaned in closer, pressing his chest against her back, trying to shield her with what little strength he had left. His own jacket had stopped helping hours ago. The lining was torn, the zipper broken, but he didn't care. He didn't need it. She did. He looked down at her face. There was snow in her hair. Her skin had turned pale, almost translucent, and for a moment, he panicked. "Margaret?" No answer. He shook her gently. "Margaret, hey, you still with me?" A pause, a breath. Then, "I'm just tired," she whispered. Her voice sounded far away, smaller, like a child's. He pressed his forehead against the side of her head. "You gotta stay awake, okay? Just a little longer." She didn't reply. He searched the street again. Nothing. No lights, no sound, no movement. He hadn't seen a single car pass since they sat down. It was like the world had closed its eyes. He whispered to her again, "Tell me something, anything, a memory. Your son, what's he like?" Margaret stirred. Her lips moved slowly. "David, he had curly hair, just like his father, always wanted to climb things." Christopher smiled softly. "That's good. Keep going." "He used to sing to me," she murmured, "when he was small, before the world got too loud." Then she was quiet again. Christopher clenched his jaw. The cold was making it hard to think now. He could feel his fingers going numb, his toes too. The kind of numb that wasn't normal, the kind that made you worry if they'd come back. He thought about leaving, just for a minute, to find help, knock on a door, bang on a window. But every time he started to shift away, Margaret whimpered, and every time she did, his chest ached. He couldn't leave her. She was someone's mother. She was his mother, in a way that only made sense in moments like this. He reached into his bag and pulled out the only other thing he had, a small zippered pouch that held the photo of his mom, and the harmonica she gave him before she died. He couldn't play anymore, his lips too cold, his breath too shaky, but he held it anyway. "I used to play this for my mum," he said aloud, voice soft. "When she was in the hospital. She said music made the pain float." Margaret didn't respond, but he kept talking. "She used to say, 'Gee, you'll never be poor if you still have kindness.'" He laughed once, bitter and hollow. "Didn't make sense to me back then. Thought kindness didn't feed you, didn't keep the lights on." He looked at Margaret's face, peaceful but far too still. But maybe she was right. Maybe this is the only thing that matters. He didn't know how long they sat like that. Minutes, hours. Time had no shape anymore, only cold and silence and prayer. He didn't speak them out loud, just let them echo through his heart. "God, please, just get her through this. Forget me. Just save her." A gust of wind broke around the corner of the wall, sharp as glass. Christopher winced. He pulled Margaret closer again, though he barely had the strength. Then, faint. So faint he thought he imagined it. A squeal. Tires. Far off. He lifted his head, turned. A car. Headlights cutting through the snow, approaching slowly, then faster. Christopher's lips parted, but he didn't speak. Didn't move, because his body couldn't anymore. His eyes fluttered. He looked at Margaret one last time, her face resting against his chest, and he let go. Not because he wanted to, but because his body had nothing left to give. The car skidded to a stop, a door slammed, footsteps, fast, heavy, running, and somewhere behind his fading mind, Christopher heard a voice. "Mom, oh God, Mom!" But by then the world had gone quiet, and the snow just kept falling. The hospital room was warm. David sat in a chair between two beds, a cup of untouched coffee cooling in his hands. The lights overhead were soft, but nothing felt soft about this moment. His mother was still. And the boy, Christopher, the nurse had called him, hadn't opened his eyes since the ambulance. Machines beeped gently. Monitors glowed. It was quiet, in the way places are when something holy or terrible has just happened. David hadn't spoken in a while. He didn't know what he'd say, who he'd say it to, or if anyone would even hear him. Margaret lay to his right, her face turned slightly toward the window. They'd given her something warm to wear, wrapped her in layers, placed heating pads beneath the blankets. The color was returning to her face, but her mind was somewhere else, still wandering, still far, to his left. Christopher. 17 maybe. Skin pale. Lips still cracked. He looked younger here. Smaller. The blanket that covered him now was clean, white, hospital-issued, but David's eyes kept drifting to the corner of the chair where the other one sat, the tattered handmade one the boy had used to cover them both. There were still traces of snow on it when they'd arrived. It was folded now neatly, as if someone couldn't bring themselves to throw it away. David stared at it. He couldn't stop thinking about that moment, that first moment, when he saw them. The boy's arms around his mother, shielding her with nothing but his body. No name, no reason, no explanation, just presence. The kind of presence David hadn't given her in years. A lump rose in his throat, sharp and dry. He hadn't meant to become distant. He hadn't chosen neglect, at least not on purpose. Life had simply gotten louder. Board meetings, takeovers, flights, success stacked on top of success, until his world was too tall for anyone to reach him, including her, especially her. And somewhere along the climb he stopped calling as often. Hired people to stand in for love. Sent flowers instead of showing up. She'd always said she was fine, that the nurses were lovely, that she didn't want to be a burden. But now, in seeing her on that stretcher, blue and shaking and quiet, David knew the truth. She had needed him, and he hadn't been there. He pressed his knuckles against his lips. Across the room, Christopher stirred. His eyes opened, just slightly, blinking against the soft light. His breath shallow, chest rising with effort. David stood. "You're safe," he said quickly, voice quiet but firm. "You're in a hospital, you're okay." The boy didn't speak, just looked around, confused. Then his eyes fell on Margaret, lying motionless in the next bed. His face shifted. Fear, then relief, then something else, something David couldn't quite name. "I didn't know who she was," Christopher whispered. "I just couldn't leave her." David nodded slowly. "I know." They sat in silence. A long, full silence that said more than words. Then Christopher tried to sit up, but winced. "You should rest," David said. "I'm not staying," Christopher muttered. "Did what I could. I'll go after." David didn't answer right away. He pulled the old blanket from the chair and placed it gently on the end of Christopher's bed. "Is this yours?" he asked. Christopher nodded, eyes lowered. "My mom made it, before she passed." David stared at it for a moment, then looked at him. "You kept her warm," he said quietly. "You kept both of you warm." Christopher swallowed hard. "It's what she would have done." David didn't know what to say to that, but something in him cracked, not all at once, not loudly, just enough to let a little light in. He turned back toward the window, arms folded. "Don't leave yet," he said finally. "Please." "Why?" David's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Because I don't think this is over." Christopher didn't respond, but he didn't argue either. And as the quiet settled in again, two men sat in silence, one burdened by what he'd missed, the other unsure why he'd been called to step in. And between them, a woman sleeping beneath hospital sheets, whose life had just changed both of theirs. The car ride home was quiet, not cold, not tense, just quiet, like something fragile had entered the space between them, and neither man knew how to hold it yet. Christopher sat in the back seat, staring out the window. David didn't say much. He just drove, eyes fixed on the snow-covered road ahead, one hand on the wheel, one hand resting near the old blanket folded on the passenger seat. The same blanket Christopher had carried like a second skin, the same one he'd used to save a woman he didn't know. The silence stretched. As they pulled through the estate gates, something in David's chest shifted. He'd passed through those gates 1,000 times, but this time felt different. Not because of who was inside, but because of who was coming in. He parked near the side entrance. The snow had finally stopped, but the ground still crunched beneath their shoes. Christopher hesitated when he stepped out. His eyes flicked upward toward the house, then toward the edges of the property, then toward the horizon, as if deciding whether to stay or run. David noticed. "You're not a prisoner," he said, voice low. "You don't have to stay, but I'd like you to." Christopher didn't answer right away. "I don't belong here," he said. David paused, then gestured to a smaller path behind the house, toward the guest house tucked into the trees. "Come in for the night," he offered. "Get warm, rest. That's all." Christopher looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. The guest house was quiet, a soft two-bedroom cottage used mostly for business guests or distant family. Clean, private, simple. David unlocked the door, stepped inside first, and flicked on the lights. "I'll send up some food. There's a shower. Extra clothes in the closet. Probably too big, but better than hospital gowns." Christopher stood in the doorway, not moving. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. David turned to face him. "Because you saved my mother's life." "I didn't do it for anything. I know." Silence. "But that doesn't mean you don't deserve something," David said. "You matter, son." Christopher flinched slightly at the word. Son. He hadn't heard it in a while, not in a way that meant anything. He looked down, his voice quieter now. "People only let me stay when they want something." David shook his head. I don't want anything. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the folded blanket and placed it on the couch gently, like something sacred. Your mother made this? He asked. Christopher nodded once. She used to say. He paused, then finished, barely audible. Even if the world forgets you, God won't. David sat down slowly across from him. I think she was right. The silence settled again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was full. David stood. I'll give you some space, he said. You've had enough eyes on you for one day. Christopher didn't move. He just stood there in the doorway, one hand on the doorknob, one foot still outside, and then, slowly, he stepped in. He closed the door behind him, not with certainty, but with a kind of surrender, the kind that says, maybe just for tonight I don't have to run. David watched him for a moment longer, then turned to leave. Before he reached the door, he stopped. Thank you, Christopher. Christopher didn't say anything, didn't need to. That night in the quiet of the guest house, Christopher sat on the edge of the bed, blanket in his hands, unsure if he was still dreaming. And in the silence, David stood alone in the hallway outside, one man wondering if he could give someone a home, the other wondering if he could ever belong to one again. It had been 2 weeks since the storm. The snow had melted off the trees. The air was still cold, but calmer now. There was sun most days, the kind that didn't bring warmth, but reminded you it might come back. Christopher hadn't left the guest house. David hadn't asked him to. There were fresh clothes in the drawers, food on the counter. Tutors came by once just to test the waters. No one pushed, no one pressured. But every morning, Margaret would ask the same question from her armchair by the window. Is he still here? And when David said yes, her face softened. He's a good boy, she'd whisper, then go back to staring at the wind chimes. Christopher helped where he could, quietly. He carried books to Margaret's room, set the table, took the trash out without being asked. He never lingered, never assumed. He moved like someone trying not to wake the house. But David saw him, saw the way he looked at the photos in the hallway, the way he paused before entering a room, like he was waiting for someone to tell him he didn't belong there. And it broke something in David, slowly. So one afternoon, he knocked on the guest house door and stepped inside with 2 mugs of coffee. Christopher was seated on the floor, hunched over a notebook. Working on something? David asked. Christopher shrugged. Just writing. David handed him the coffee, sat across from him on the rug. You've been quiet lately. Christopher nodded. David waited. I don't know how to be here, Christopher finally said. David studied him. You're already here. I mean, I don't know how to accept it. There it was, the confession under every quiet gesture. David set his mug down. This isn't charity, he said gently. It's not a favor. I brought you here because I wanted you here. Christopher looked away. I'm not used to people wanting me anywhere. David leaned back. My father left when I was 7, he said. I never really forgave him for it, not even after he died. Christopher looked up. I spent years thinking I had to earn everything. Love, approval, belonging. If I wasn't useful, I wasn't worth keeping. A pause. I think I've done the same thing to other people, including my mom. Christopher stared at the coffee in his hands. The mug had a crack in it. Are you saying I remind you of you? David gave a quiet smile. I'm saying, I see myself in you, and I don't want to make the same mistake again. The silence that followed felt sacred, but it didn't last, because just then the front door opened, fast. David's business partner, Eric, stepped in unannounced. David, I've been calling. We've got 3 properties falling through. Wait. He stopped. His eyes landed on Christopher, the couch, the notebooks, the coffee. This him? Eric asked, lowering his voice. The boy from the papers? David stood slowly. Eric. I just thought he was gone by now, Eric said with a sharp glance. Didn't realize we were running a shelter now. The room fell cold. Christopher's eyes dropped. His body stiffened. "I should go," he said quickly, rising. "No," David said, stepping forward. "You stay." But Christopher was already grabbing his things. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He just moved like someone who'd been here before, who recognized the change in a room when it stopped being safe. David caught his arm, gently. "You don't have to leave." Christopher looked at him, eyes dark and quiet. "Yes, I do." He stepped past Eric and out the door. David stood there, the air in the room thick with everything that hadn't been said. He could still feel the warmth of the coffee mug in his palm. And somewhere behind him, the old blanket lay folded on the edge of the couch, waiting. The guest house was quiet. The mug Christopher had left behind still sat on the table, cold and half full. The folded blanket hadn't moved. Neither had David. He stood in the center of the room long after the boy walked out. He hadn't said much to Eric after that. Just one look, sharp, cold, and final. Eric had gotten the message. He left without another word. Now. It was just David. The clock on the wall ticked softly, but time didn't feel like it was moving. Not really. It just sat, heavy, unmoving, like the weight in his chest. He'd messed up. Not with what he said, but with what he hadn't done fast enough. He should have stepped in sooner, should have spoken louder, should have shut the door before the boy heard something that sounded too familiar. David sat on the couch and put his face in his hands. He was losing him, the one person who reminded him what mattered, the one soul that hadn't asked for anything and gave everything. David thought about the look in Christopher's eyes, not anger, not defiance, just something quieter, something older, the look of someone who'd learned over and over again that safety never stayed, that kindness usually had a deadline, that the moment you started to believe you belonged, someone reminded you you didn't. David leaned back and stared at the ceiling. How do you rebuild trust when you barely know how to hold it? He stood slowly, crossed the room and picked up the blanket, ran his fingers over the stitches in the corner. He remembered what Christopher had said the night he arrived. She made this, before she passed. Something about that line stayed with him, not just the grief but the care, the memory sewn into every thread. David folded it carefully, then held it to his chest, and for the first time in years he whispered something that sounded like a prayer. Later that evening the estate was quiet. Margaret sat near the window, holding a cup of tea with both hands. Her eyes were clearer today, not fully lucid, but closer. David sat across from her. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then she looked up. "Where's the boy?" she asked softly. David looked down. "He left." Margaret didn't respond at first. "He shouldn't have," she said. David nodded once. "I know." She took a slow sip of tea. "He reminds me of James," she said quietly. David looked at her, surprised. "Dad?" She nodded. He had that same look, like the world hadn't been kind to him, but he hadn't let it change his heart. David swallowed. "I think he's sleeping on the street again," he said, barely above a whisper. Margaret reached across the table and touched his hand. "Then go find him." David looked into her eyes. "You think he'll want to come back?" Her voice didn't waver. "He doesn't need to want to. He needs to know someone still sees him." That night, David drove slowly through the streets of town. He didn't know where to look. Christopher didn't have a phone. No last name. No place. He passed the diner on 8th, the shelter gate near the train tracks, the alley behind the church where the Christmas decorations were still up. Nothing. Then, just past the bridge, he saw a shape curled on a bench. A figure wrapped in a too-thin jacket, knees tucked to chest, head down. David pulled over, stepped out. His footsteps were loud on the frozen pavement. Christopher didn't move. David knelt beside him, quietly. He didn't speak at first, just placed the blanket, folded warm, across the boy's back. Christopher stirred, blinking slowly, but didn't sit up. David spoke, voice low. "I didn't bring you into that house to fix you. I brought you in because you showed me something I'd forgotten, and I'm not letting you walk away without knowing that." Silence. Then Christopher whispered, "I didn't mean to stay. I just didn't want to leave yet." David's voice broke a little. "Then don't." They sat there on the bench for a long time, no promises, just two people in the cold, one who had lost too much, and one finally learning how to hold something that stayed. The house was quiet again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of something softer. Christopher had been back for a week. He still didn't say much, still kept to himself. But now, when David asked him to join for dinner, he said yes. When Margaret called for him, he came, helped her with her slippers, held her arm as she walked through the garden. Some mornings David would wake early, glance out the window and see Christopher on the porch, knees drawn up, blanket over his shoulders, just watching the sun rise. Something about the way he sat reminded David of his younger self, always halfway out the door just in case love turned cold. But the air had shifted between them. The silence was no longer filled with fear. It was filled with learning how to stay. The night of the gala arrived quietly. It wasn't flashy, David had insisted. Just a warm evening at the estate. Candles, music, friends, families, supporters. The Margaret Scott Foundation for Homeless Youth was being introduced to the world. Christopher had helped design the logo. He didn't ask for credit, but David told the team to place his name at the bottom of every flyer. Youth Advisor, Christopher James. He hadn't told Christopher yet. He wanted him to see it for the first time when he walked in. That evening, Margaret sat in her wheelchair by the fireplace, wearing a soft blue shawl and a small string of pearls. David bent down beside her, straightened the blanket across her knees. "You okay, Mom?" She nodded slowly. "Do they know about the boy?" she asked. David smiled. "Tonight they will." Guests arrived in waves, handshakes, stories, warm hugs. But through it all, David's eyes kept drifting to the entryway, waiting for one person. Then he saw him, Christopher, wearing a dark sweater, hair combed, nervous. He paused in the doorway, unsure. David stepped forward, offering a quiet nod, not beckoning, not demanding. Just an open door. Christopher stepped in. The room felt warmer. Margaret smiled when she saw him, reached for his hand. "You look like someone I used to love," she whispered. "You still do," he said, kneeling beside her. David took the mic later that night. The lights dimmed. The crowd hushed. And for the first time, he told the story publicly. About the night his mother nearly died. About the gates left open. About a boy with nothing but a blanket, and the kind of love money couldn't measure. He didn't cry at first, but when he said, "He gave her back to me," his voice cracked, and the room broke open with silence. He turned to Christopher then, who stood quietly near the piano, hands folded. "Will you come up?" David asked. Christopher looked unsure, but Margaret gave a small nod, and so he walked forward, slowly, humbly. The crowd didn't clap, not yet. They watched him like something sacred had entered the room. David handed him the mic. Christopher stared down for a moment, then looked up. "I didn't know who she was," he said softly, "but I knew she was cold and scared, and I couldn't walk away." He paused. "My mom used to say, 'Kindness is the only thing that proves we're still human.'" Another pause. "I just stayed, that's all." But those three words wrapped around the room like a benediction. I just stayed. And then, a standing ovation. No music, no grand speech. Just truth, spoken in the quietest voice in the room. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the lights dimmed, David and Christopher walked down the long stone path toward the front gate, the same place where it all began. They stopped at the spot where the snow had been, where a boy had wrapped himself around a woman he didn't know. David looked at him. "Everything changed here," he said. Christopher looked up at the stars. "Because I didn't walk away." 2 years later, the house felt different, quieter in some ways, fuller in others. The walls no longer echoed with silence. They held memories now, laughter, music, conversations at the dinner table that didn't rush. Margaret had passed away one morning in spring. The cherry blossoms had just started to bloom. Christopher had been the one sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, reading aloud from her favorite poetry book. She'd opened her eyes only once that morning, looked at him, then at David, and whispered, "You both came back to me." Those were her last words. She passed with peace on her face, with love on both sides of her, and with a life redeemed, not through wealth or achievement, but through presence. Christopher didn't move back into the guest house after that. He stayed in the main house, not because David asked him to, but because by then it felt like home. He still carried the blanket, the one his mother had made, still folded it every night, still kept it close, but now it rested beside textbooks, not under bridges. Christopher had enrolled in college, studying social work. "I want to be the one who sees people," he told David one day, "the way nobody used to see me." He volunteered at the youth shelter every weekend, helped kids find their feet, taught them how to open bank accounts, how to speak up, how to stay kind, even when the world wasn't. The staff at the foundation called him Mr. James, but most of the kids just called him Chris. They trusted him, not because of his title, but because of his story. On the anniversary of that night, the one that changed everything, David and Christopher drove to a small cemetery just outside town. They didn't speak much, just walked together to a modest stone beneath an old oak tree. Margaret Scott, beloved mother. Kindness is the proof of love. David knelt down first, placed a single rose. Christopher stood beside him, holding something in his hands, a harmonica, the last thing his mother ever gave him. He hadn't played it since the night he nearly froze to death, but today he did. He sat on the grass, eyes closed, breath slow, and played Amazing Grace. Soft, broken, full, the wind barely moved. The world just listened. David didn't speak, didn't wipe his tears. He just sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder. When the song ended, they stayed there for a while. Two lives that had once lived on opposite sides of a locked gate, now bound by something that didn't need words. Back at the foundation, a new boy arrived that evening, maybe 14, thin, quiet, hands buried in the sleeves of an oversized hoodie. He stood near the door, eyes darting between strangers. Christopher saw him from across the room. He walked over slowly, not with authority, but kneeled down to his level, offered his hand. "Hey," he said, "I'm Chris." The boy didn't answer. "That's okay," Chris said gently. "You don't have to talk yet." He stood and gestured down the hallway. "Come on, you're safe here." The boy hesitated, then followed. Some stories begin with a miracle. Ours began with a blanket, torn at the edges, threadbare, but wrapped in love. It was never about rescue. It was always about staying, when it was hard, when it was cold, when no one else stopped. Christopher James stayed. And because he did, a woman lived, a billionaire found his soul, and 100 more found a home. One act of kindness can change a life. Sometimes it changes two, and sometimes it saves them all. And if this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that kindness still matters, that broken people can become blessings, and that love still finds its way home, then stay with us. Here at Elevated Heart Stories, we don't just tell stories, we share moments that lift the soul. Stories that remind us of God's hand in the quiet places, of people who chose to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. So if your heart is still beating a little heavier than usual, if something inside you whispered, "Don't forget this," subscribe, like this video, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Because maybe, just maybe, you've been the one who stayed, or you're still waiting for someone who will. We're honored to have you here. Until next time, this is Elevated Heart Stories, where love still lives and hope never leaves the room. They broke free from their father's hands and ran. The little girls who hadn't smiled or spoken in 18 months suddenly running, laughing, down a Manhattan sidewalk toward a homeless woman they'd never met. Their father stood there, frozen in shock, watching them throw themselves into her arms. Because for a year and a half, those girls hadn't touched anyone. Not since the day their mother died. What he didn't know was that this moment, this impossible moment, was about to change everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October. The city was loud, people rushing everywhere, car horns blaring, the usual chaos of Manhattan. And there he was, Andrew Smith, walking 3 silent little girls to another doctor's appointment, another specialist who probably wouldn't help, another failure waiting to happen. Lily, Chloe, and Ella, his daughters, 5 years old, triplets. For 18 months, they hadn't said a word, hadn't cried, hadn't laughed, not since their mother Sarah died in that car accident on the FDR Drive. Andrew had tried everything, every doctor, every kind of therapy, spent money most people would never see in a lifetime, Yale psychologists, specialists from Johns Hopkins, a clinic in Switzerland that cost $50,000 a week, but nothing worked. The girls just stared, walked when you moved them, ate when you fed them, but they weren't really there. It was like watching 3 little lights go out, one by one, and not being able to turn them back on. He was losing them, and he knew it, and that knowledge was crushing him. That afternoon, they passed a woman sitting on the sidewalk near 73rd Street, homeless, older, worn jacket, quiet. Her name was Josephine. She looked up at the girls and smiled, just smiled, nothing more. And something impossible happened. Lily blinked, really blinked, like she was waking up. Chloe turned her head. Ella's hand twitched. Andrew's heart stopped. He looked back over his shoulder. The girls were looking back too, actually looking, present. The next day, he walked the same route on purpose. Josephine was there. She smiled again. And the girls smiled back. Smiled, for the first time in a year and a half. On the 3rd day, they ran. Just broke free from his hands and ran straight to her, laughing, actually laughing for the first time since Sarah died. Andrew collapsed on the curb right there on 5th Avenue, sobbing like a child, while strangers walked past annoyed, because his daughters were alive again. Before we begin, like this video, subscribe, and tell me where in the world you're watching from, because this story will remind you that sometimes God sends the answer in the form of the person everyone else walks past. That grace doesn't always arrive the way we expect it, and that miracles are still real. Let's continue. Andrew sat on that curb for what felt like forever, watching his daughters hold on to this stranger like she was the only safe place left in the world. People kept walking past. A woman in a business suit nearly stepped on his hand. Someone muttered something about blocking the sidewalk, but he couldn't move, couldn't process what he was seeing. Josephine was holding all 3 girls, rocking them gently, humming something soft under her breath. The girls had their faces buried in her jacket, and they were making sounds, little happy sounds, he hadn't heard since Sarah was alive. Finally, he stood up, walked over slowly, like approaching something fragile that might break if he moved too fast. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice still shaking. "I'm Andrew Smith. These are my daughters." Josephine looked up at him. Her eyes were kind but tired, the kind of tired that comes from years, not just days. "I can see they needed some love," she said quietly. "That's all I gave them." "They haven't." Andrew stopped, swallowed hard. "They haven't done this. Not in 18 months. Not since my wife died." Josephine nodded slowly, like she understood more than he was saying. She touched Lily's hair, then Chloe's, then Ella's. "Grief does that to children, makes them go far away inside, where it feels safer. I've tried everything." The words came out broken. "Doctors, therapy. I don't know what else to do." "You're doing it right now," Josephine said. "You brought them outside. You let them feel something." The girls finally pulled back a little, but they didn't let go of her hands. Ella looked up at Josephine with wide eyes, then reached out and touched her face, like checking if she was real. Josephine smiled. "Hello, sweetheart." Ella didn't say anything back, but she didn't look away either. Andrew felt his throat tighten again. I know this sounds strange, but would you mind if we came back? Tomorrow, maybe?" "They seem to. They seem to feel safe," Josephine finished for him. She studied his face for a moment. "You can come back. Same time, I'll be here." Thank you. He meant it with everything he had. Thank you so much. Josephine carefully untangled herself from the girls, which took some effort because they didn't want to let go. I'll see you tomorrow, okay? I promise. Chloe made a soft sound, almost like a whimper. I promise, Josephine repeated, looking right at her. Tomorrow. Andrew took their hands, they let him this time, and started walking toward the doctor's office. But every few steps, all three girls looked back. And every time they did, Josephine was still there, watching them, waving gently. They never made it to the appointment. Andrew called and cancelled from the sidewalk. He didn't see the point anymore. How could some doctor in an office do what this woman just did in 5 minutes? That night, the girls were different. Not talking, not yet, but present. They sat at the dinner table and actually looked at their food. Ella picked up her fork on her own. Lily drank her water without being prompted. Margaret, the housekeeper, noticed immediately. Mr. Smith, she said quietly, standing in the kitchen doorway. What happened today? Andrew looked at his daughters, then back at Margaret. I don't know, but I think we might have found something. Found what? Hope, he said. I think we found hope. The next afternoon, Andrew left work at 2 o'clock. First time in over a year he'd walked out before dark. His assistant looked confused. Mr. Smith, you have the board call at 3. Reschedule it, he said, already halfway out the door. He picked up the girls from Margaret early. They were waiting by the front door when he got home, already wearing their shoes, like they knew, like they remembered. The walk to 73rd Street felt longer than it should have. Andrew's heart was pounding the whole way. What if she wasn't there? What if yesterday was just chance? What if it never happened again? But when they turned the corner, there she was. Same spot, same worn blue jacket, same quiet presence. And the girls lit up. Not running this time, but pulling on his hands, tugging him forward, little sounds coming from their throats. Excitement. Actual excitement. Josephine saw them coming, and her whole face softened. Well, hello again. This time, the girls went to her slowly, almost shy, but they went, sat down right there on the concrete beside her, one on each side, Ella in the middle. Andrew stood a few feet back, not wanting to intrude, not wanting to break whatever this was. I brought you something, Josephine said, reaching into her canvas bag. She pulled out 3 small pieces of paper, folded into shapes, origami birds. Simple, a little crooked, but made with care. She handed one to each girl. These are for you, to remind you that even small things can fly. Lily held hers carefully, turning it over in her hands. Chloe pressed hers to her chest. Ella looked at Josephine and smiled, actually smiled, and Josephine's eyes filled with tears. There it is, she whispered. There's that beautiful smile. They sat like that for almost an hour. Josephine talked to them about simple things, the weather, the birds she'd seen that morning, a dog that had walked by earlier with floppy ears. She didn't ask them questions, didn't push them to respond, just talked, like they were already friends. And the girls listened, really listened, leaning against her. Chloe even rested her head on Josephine's shoulder. Andrew watched, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. Gratitude, relief, fear that it might end. A man in a suit walked by and dropped a $5 bill into the small cup beside Josephine. She glanced at it but didn't pick it up, didn't move. The girls were more important. When it was time to go, Josephine touched each of their faces gently. Same time tomorrow? Ella nodded. Actually nodded. Andrew's breath caught. Thank you, he said again. It was all he could think to say. Don't thank me yet, Josephine said softly, looking up at him. We're just getting started. Walking home, Lily reached up and held Andrew's hand tighter than she had in months. Not limp, not lifeless, holding on. That night, for the first time since Sarah died, Andrew didn't pour himself a drink after the girls went to bed. He didn't need to run anymore. He sat in the living room, holding one of the origami birds Ella had left on the table, and let himself feel something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. By the end of the week, it had become their routine. Every afternoon at 3 o'clock, Andrew and the girls would walk to 73rd Street, and Josephine would be there, waiting. She started bringing little things, a worn children's book she'd found at a shelter, colourful stones she'd picked up from the park. Once, she brought 3 dandelions, one for each girl, and showed them how to make a wish before blowing the seeds into the wind. Lily went first, closed her eyes tight, whispered something so soft Andrew couldn't hear, and blew. The seeds scattered into the autumn air. Chloe did the same, then Ella. Andrew watched his daughters make wishes again, something he thought he'd never see. On the 6th day, Chloe spoke. It was just one word, Jo, short for Josephine, but it was a word, a real word, from her mouth, her voice. Josephine's hand flew to her chest. Andrew had to turn away so they wouldn't see him crying. The next day, Ella said it too, Jo, then Lily, Jo. They had a name for her now, a name they chose. Andrew started staying longer each visit, sitting on the curb beside them, listening to Josephine's stories about growing up in the Bronx, about her late husband who used to sing to her, about the daughter she'd lost. One afternoon, she pulled out the photo she always carried, a young woman with kind eyes and a bright smile. "This is Grace," she said quietly. "My daughter. She struggled, with pain I couldn't fix, and one day she was just gone." Andrew looked at the photo, then at Josephine. "I'm so sorry." "Me too." She tucked the photo back into her bag. "But your girls, they've given me something to hold on to again, a reason to wake up smiling." Andrew felt something crack open inside him. This woman had nothing, lived in shelters, survived on spare change, and somehow she was the one giving. That night, lying in bed, Andrew couldn't stop thinking. Josephine shouldn't be on that street. She shouldn't be sleeping in shelters. Not when she was doing what 50 doctors couldn't do. Not when she was bringing his daughters back to life. He could fix this. He could help her, give her stability, security, a home. It made perfect sense. The next afternoon, after the girls had been sitting with Josephine for an hour, after they'd laughed at a story she told about a pigeon stealing someone's sandwich, Andrew asked Margaret to take the girls for ice cream down the block. "Just for a few minutes," he said. The girls hesitated, but Josephine smiled. "Go on, sweethearts. I'll be right here." When they were gone, Andrew sat down beside her. "Josephine, I need to talk to you about something." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "What you're doing for my daughters, it's a miracle. I don't know how else to say it. You've given them back to me." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want to hire you, officially, $10,000 a month, health insurance. I'll find you an apartment, cover your rent, all your expenses. You won't have to sleep in shelters anymore. You won't have to—" "Stop." Her voice was quiet but firm. Andrew blinked. "I'm trying to help." "No." Josephine stood up, slowly, her joints stiff. "You're trying to buy me." "That's not. You think you can put a price on what those girls need." Her eyes weren't angry. They were sad, disappointed. "I came to them with love, Mr. Smith, not because someone was going to pay me. I don't want your money. I don't want to be another person on your payroll." "Josephine, please. You're trying to turn Grace into a transaction." She gathered her bag, her hands shaking slightly. "And that's exactly what's wrong. You can't buy everything. You can't control everything. Some things just are." "I didn't mean to offend you." "Yes, you did. You just don't realize it yet." She looked toward where the girls had gone, her expression softening for a moment, then breaking. "Tell them, I'm sorry." "Wait." But she was already walking away, her cart rattling behind her, disappearing into the crowd. Andrew sat there alone on the sidewalk, his hands shaking. What had he just done? When the girls came back with Margaret, holding half-melted ice cream cones, they looked around for Josephine. She wasn't there. Lily's smile faded first, then Chloe's. Ella dropped her cone on the sidewalk. "Where's Jo?" Chloe's voice was small, confused. Andrew opened his mouth, but nothing came out. What could he say? That he'd ruined it? That he'd treated her like a problem to solve instead of a person? "She had to go," he finally managed. She'll be back." But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. Ella started making a sound, low at first, then louder. Not words, just pain, raw and unfiltered. Then Lily started. Then Chloe. And then they were crying, actually crying, real tears for the first time in over a year, streaming down their faces as they stood there on the sidewalk, looking at the empty spot where Josephine used to sit. People stopped to stare. A woman asked if they were okay. Andrew barely heard her. He knelt down, tried to pull his daughters close, but they pushed him away. Actually pushed him, stepped back like they didn't want him touching them. That hurt worse than anything. Margaret took over, gentle but firm, gathering the girls and guiding them toward home. Andrew followed behind, numb, watching his daughters cry for someone who wasn't him. That night, they went silent again. Worse than before, because now they knew what they were missing. Now they'd tasted hope and had it taken away. They wouldn't eat dinner, wouldn't look at him. Just sat in their room staring at the origami birds Josephine had made, holding them like they might disappear too. Andrew stood in the doorway watching them, his chest hollow. Around 10, he went to his study and sat on the floor with his back against the desk. The room was dark, except for the city lights coming through the window. He didn't hear Margaret come in, didn't realize she was there until she spoke. "What did you do, Mr. Smith?" Her voice wasn't harsh, just tired, disappointed. "I tried to help her," Andrew said, his voice flat. "I offered her money, a place to live, security." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she sat down beside him on the floor, which was something she'd never done in all the years she'd worked for him. "You insulted her," she said softly. "I was trying to—" "You treated her like a service you could purchase." Margaret looked at him, and her eyes were sad. "Josephine doesn't want to be your employee, Mr. Smith. She wants to be your friend, your family. You took something pure, something real, and you tried to put a price tag on it." Andrew stared at his hands. "That woman has nothing," Margaret continued. "Nothing but her dignity, and you tried to buy that too. I didn't mean—" "You did, because that's all you know. Buy the best doctors, buy the best therapy, buy a solution. But love doesn't work that way. Grace doesn't work that way." She paused. "Your wife would be ashamed of what you did today." That broke him. Andrew put his face in his hands and cried. Not the quiet tears he'd cried before. This was deeper, shaking his whole body, because Margaret was right, about all of it. He'd spent 18 months trying to buy his way out of grief, trying to fix his daughters like they were a business problem. And the one person who actually reached them, who loved them without wanting anything he treated like hired help. "How do I fix this?" he whispered. Margaret stood up slowly. "Not with your wallet, Mr. Smith. You're going to have to do something you haven't done in a very long time." "What?" "Humble yourself. Get on your knees if you have to, and ask for forgiveness." Andrew didn't sleep that night. He sat in the girls' room watching them. They'd finally fallen asleep, but their faces were still tight, even in rest, little fists clutching those paper birds. Around 3 in the morning, he made a decision. The next day, he cancelled everything, every meeting, every call, every commitment. "Tell them I'm unavailable," he told his assistant. "Indefinitely." She looked shocked. Andrew Smith didn't cancel things. He lived for work. But not anymore. He started searching that morning, went back to 73rd Street first. Josephine wasn't there. Asked the bodega owner on the corner if he'd seen her. "The lady with the cart? Nah, man, not today." Andrew walked 10 blocks, checking every corner, every alley. Nothing. He thought about what Margaret had said, that Josephine lived in shelters, so he started calling them, made a list, wrote down addresses. By noon, he'd been to 3 different shelters in Midtown. No one had seen her. At the 4th one, a woman at the front desk recognized her name. "Josephine Baker? Yeah, I know her. Sweet lady. But she hasn't been here in a couple days." "Where else does she stay?" The woman hesitated. "I'm not supposed to." "Please." Andrew's voice cracked. "I hurt her. I need to apologize. I need to make this right." Something in his face must have convinced her. She wrote down 2 more addresses. Try Holy Apostles, or maybe Covenant House in Hell's Kitchen. Andrew thanked her and kept going. It took 2 days. 2 full days of searching, calling, walking through neighborhoods he'd never been to, places his money had kept him away from his whole life. He saw things he'd never noticed before, people sleeping in subway stations, families waiting in line for food, children with worn-out shoes. and he realized how blind he'd been. On the third day, someone at a soup kitchen said, "Try the community room at Covenant House. She likes to read there in the afternoons." Andrew's heart was pounding as he walked through the doors. The community room was modest, clean but worn, people sitting at tables, reading, talking quietly, and there, in the corner by a window, was Josephine. She was reading a paperback, her canvas bag beside her chair. Andrew walked over slowly. His hands were shaking. She looked up, saw him. Her expression didn't change. "Josephine," he said quietly, "I need to talk to you. I don't think—" He dropped to his knees, right there in front of everyone. People stopped talking, turned to look. "Please," Andrew said, his voice breaking. "Please just listen." Josephine stared at him, her book forgotten in her lap. "I was wrong." The words came out raw, honest, completely wrong. "I've spent my whole life believing money solves everything. Build a bigger company, make a bigger deal. But you can't buy love. You can't purchase belonging." He looked up at her, tears on his face. "I treated you like a problem to solve, like something I could hire. And I'm ashamed." Josephine's eyes softened, but she stayed quiet. "My daughters need you," Andrew continued. "Not because I'm paying you, but because you chose to love them, because you saw them when everyone else just walked past." His voice dropped to a whisper. "And I need you. I need to learn what you know, how to love without controlling, how to give without expecting." He took a shaky breath. "I'm not offering you a job, Josephine. I'm asking if you'll be part of our lives, as family, as a friend, not as someone who works for me, just as someone who belongs." The room was completely silent now. Josephine looked at him for a long time, studying his face, his tears, his brokenness. Then she reached down and touched his shoulder. "Get up, Andrew." She used his first name. That small thing felt like grace. He stood, waiting, barely breathing. "I'll come back," she said quietly, "but on one condition." "Anything?" "I'm not staff. I'm not help. I'm family." Her voice was firm but kind. "That means I sit at your table, not in the kitchen. It means the girls call me whatever they want. It means you don't get to control this with contracts or money. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear," Andrew whispered. "And one more thing." Josephine stood up, looking him straight in the eye. "You stop running from your grief. You stop hiding in work. Those girls need a father who's present. Not perfect, just present." Andrew nodded, unable to speak. "When can you come?" he finally asked. Josephine picked up her bag. "Right now. Let's not waste any more time." The ride back to the penthouse was quiet. Andrew sat in the front of the car, Josephine in the back. Neither of them spoke much. What was there to say? Everything had already been said on the floor of that community room. But as they got closer, Andrew felt his chest tightening. What if it didn't work? What if too much time had passed? What if the girls had shut down so completely this time that even Josephine couldn't reach them? "They might not," he started, then stopped. Josephine looked at him through the rearview mirror. "They will," she said simply, like she knew something he didn't. When they pulled up to the building, Andrew's hands were shaking so badly he could barely open the door. Margaret met them in the lobby. Her eyes went straight to Josephine, and something like relief washed over her face. "Thank God," she whispered. "Where are the girls?" Andrew asked. "Upstairs, in their room. They haven't come out all day." The elevator ride felt like forever. Andrew kept glancing at Josephine, looking for reassurance, but she just stood there, calm and steady, holding her canvas bag. When they reached the penthouse, Margaret opened the door quietly. The apartment was silent. Andrew's heart sank. That terrible, suffocating silence that had filled this place for 18 months. It was back. "Let me," Josephine said softly. She walked toward the girls' room slowly. Andrew and Margaret followed a few steps behind, not wanting to intrude but unable to stay away. The door was half open. Inside, all three girls were sitting on the floor by the window, still holding those paper birds. They weren't playing, weren't moving, just sitting there, staring at nothing. Josephine stepped into the doorway, and Lily saw her first. Time stopped. Lily's eyes went wide, her mouth opened, and then she screamed, not in fear, in joy, and scrambled to her feet. Chloe's head snapped up. Ella turned so fast she knocked over a book. And then they ran. All three of them, running across the room, their little feet pounding on the hardwood, voices, actual voices, crying out as they crashed into Josephine all at once. She dropped to her knees and caught them. And Lily looked up at her face, tears streaming, and said it. "Josephine, we missed you." Complete sentence, clear, perfect, real. Andrew's legs gave out. He collapsed against the doorframe, his hand over his mouth, trying not to sob out loud. "We missed you so much," Chloe was saying, her words tumbling out fast, like a dam breaking. "Where did you go? Why didn't you come back?" "Don't leave again," Ella begged, her small hands gripping Josephine's jacket. "Please, don't leave again." "I won't, sweetheart. I promise. I'm here now. I'm here." Josephine was crying too, holding all three girls, rocking them gently. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Margaret stood beside Andrew, her hand on his shoulder, tears running down her face. Andrew couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could barely process what he was hearing. His daughters were speaking. After 18 months of silence, 18 months of emptiness and fear and desperate hope, they were speaking. Josephine looked up at him from the floor, surrounded by his girls, and something passed between them. Understanding, forgiveness, family. "Thank you," Andrew mouthed, but no sound came out. She nodded. She knew. The girls were talking now, all three at once, their words overlapping, incomplete thoughts spilling out like they'd been saving them up for months. "We made pictures for you." Daddy was sad. "Are you staying? Can you stay?" Josephine touched each of their faces, memorizing them, like she couldn't believe this was real either. "I'm staying. If your daddy says it's okay, I'm staying." All three girls turned to look at Andrew. He tried to speak, but his throat was too tight, so he just nodded. Ella ran to him then, actually ran across the room and threw her arms around his waist. "She's back, Daddy. Joe's back." Andrew dropped to his knees and pulled her close, then reached for Lily and Chloe. They came without hesitation. And for the first time since Sarah died, Andrew held his daughters while they cried not empty, silent tears, but real tears, the kind that wash things clean. "I love you," he whispered into their hair. "I love you so much." And Lily whispered back, her voice small but sure, "We love you too, Daddy." Something inside him shattered and healed at the same time. That first night, nobody wanted to let go. The girls insisted Josephine stay for dinner. Then they insisted she read them a story, then another story. Then they asked if she could sleep in the guest room, just for tonight. "Please, please, please." Josephine looked at Andrew. He nodded before she could even ask. "Of course," she said. "I'd love to." Ella grabbed her hand and led her down the hall like she'd lived there forever. After the girls finally fell asleep, all three of them in Josephine's room, curled up on her bed like puppies, Andrew and Josephine sat in the living room. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when everything settles and you can finally breathe again. "I don't know how to thank you," Andrew said eventually. Josephine shook her head. "You don't need to." "But I do. What you did today." "What I did was love them." She looked at him, her eyes gentle but serious. "That's all it ever was. Not magic, not some special skill. Just love." Andrew was quiet for a moment. "I forgot how to do that. After Sarah died, I just shut down, hid in work. Told myself if I could just fix them, make them better, then everything would be okay." He paused. "But you can't fix grief, can you?" "No," Josephine said softly. "You can't. You can only walk through it, and you can't walk through it alone." She reached into her bag and pulled out the photo of Grace, held it for a moment, her thumb brushing over her daughter's face. "When Grace died, I wanted to die too," she said quietly. "Didn't see the point of waking up anymore. Ended up on the streets not because I had to, but because I didn't care. Stopped caring about everything." She looked up at Andrew. "Until I saw your girls, and something in me remembered what it felt like to matter to someone." Andrew's throat tightened. "They saved me too, Andrew," Josephine continued. "We saved each other." The next morning, Andrew did something he hadn't done in years. He made breakfast, burned the eggs, made the pancakes too thick, but he tried. The girls came running into the kitchen when they smelled food, Josephine trailing behind them with a smile. "Daddy's cooking?" Chloe sounded amazed. "Trying to," Andrew said, scraping eggs onto plates. They sat at the table together, all 5 of them, and even though the food wasn't great, even though Andrew had no idea what he was doing, it felt right. Josephine didn't sit in the kitchen. She sat at the head of the table, right where Sarah used to sit, and nobody questioned it. It just made sense. Over the next few weeks, something shifted in the apartment. It stopped feeling like a museum, started feeling like a home again. Josephine moved into the guest room permanently. The girls helped her unpack her few belongings, a change of clothes, some books, the photo of Grace, and those paper birds she kept making. Every morning, they'd have breakfast together, real conversations. The girls' vocabulary was exploding, new words every day, full sentences, questions, laughter. "Why is the sky blue, Joe? Can we go to the park today? Daddy, watch this." Andrew started coming home at 6 instead of 9, started sitting on the floor with them while they played, started reading bedtime stories again, his voice shaking at first, then getting stronger. Josephine taught them simple things: how to water the plants on the balcony, how to fold napkins into shapes, how to say thank you and mean it. She sang old songs while washing dishes. The girls would dance around the kitchen, making up words they didn't know, and Andrew would watch from the doorway with his heart so full it hurt. One Saturday morning, 3 weeks after Josephine came back, they all went to Central Park. Andrew pushed the girls on the swings. Josephine sat on a bench nearby, watching, her face peaceful in the sunlight. Lily ran over to her, breathless. "Come, push us, Joe, please." And Josephine did, stood behind the swings and pushed each girl gently, their laughter rising into the autumn air. Andrew stood back and watched his family. Not the family he'd had, not the family he'd lost, but the family they'd become. That night, after the girls were asleep, Andrew found Josephine sitting by the window in her room, looking out at the city lights. "What are you thinking about?" he asked from the doorway. She turned, smiled softly. "I was thinking how strange life is, how broken things can become beautiful again if you let them." Andrew nodded. He understood now. Healing doesn't happen in hospitals or therapy offices. It happens in kitchens, in quiet moments, in laughter over burned pancakes. It happens when someone loves you enough to stay. By mid-November, the apartment sounded different. Morning voices, doors opening and closing, footsteps running down the hall, the girls arguing over who got to help Josephine make breakfast. Normal sounds. Life sounds. Andrew would lie in bed some mornings just listening, his chest tight with gratitude. One evening, Lily brought him a drawing, a house with stick figures, 4 of them. She pointed to each one. "That's you, that's me, that's Chloe and Ella." She paused, then pointed to the 4th figure. "And that's Joe. She's family now, right?" Andrew's eyes burned. "Yeah, sweetheart, she's family." Lily nodded, satisfied, and ran off. Later that week, the girls asked about Sarah. They were sitting in the living room, all of them, when Chloe looked up at Andrew and said it. "Where's Mommy?" The question hung in the air. Andrew froze. He'd been dreading this moment, not knowing what to say, how to explain death to 5-year-olds who'd already been through so much. Josephine reached over and squeezed his hand. A silent message: "You can do this." Andrew took a breath. "Mommy's in heaven, baby. She had an accident, and she couldn't stay with us anymore." "Why not?" Ella asked, her voice small. "Sometimes things happen that we can't control, that we can't fix." His voice cracked. "I wish I could bring her back. I wish that every single day." "Does she still love us?" Lily whispered. "Oh, sweetheart." Andrew pulled her close. "She loves you more than anything in the world. She's watching over you, always." "Can she see us?" Chloe asked. "I believe she can," Josephine said gently. "And I think she's so proud of you, all of you." The girls were quiet for a moment, processing. Then Ella said, "I think she sent Joe to us because she knew we needed her." Andrew looked at Josephine. Her eyes were wet. "I think you're right," he whispered. That night, After the girls went to bed, Andrew and Josephine stayed up talking. Really talking. About Sarah, about Grace, about loss and guilt and all the ways grief changes you. I blamed myself, Andrew admitted, for not being there that night, for letting her go to that event alone, for not protecting her. Grief makes us believe we had more control than we did, Josephine said. I blamed myself for Grace too. Thought if I'd loved her better, tried harder, she wouldn't have needed those drugs. But pain isn't that simple, and neither is healing. How did you survive it? Josephine looked at him for a long moment. I almost didn't, but then I realized Grace wouldn't want me to give up. She'd want me to find reasons to smile again. So I looked for small things. A kind word from a stranger, a warm day, a child's laughter. She paused. And then I found your daughters, and they gave me a reason bigger than myself. Andrew nodded, understanding flooding through him. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city lights through the window. Thank you, Andrew said quietly, for not giving up on us. Thank you for coming back for me, Josephine replied. The weeks passed. Thanksgiving came and went, their first real family holiday. Josephine cooked a small turkey. The girls made decorations out of construction paper. Andrew attempted to bake a pie and failed spectacularly, but they ate it anyway, laughing. December arrived with the first snow. The girls pressed their faces against the windows, watching the flakes fall, their voices rising with excitement. Can we go outside? Can we build a snowman? So. Please, Daddy, please. Andrew bundled them up, hats, scarves, mittens, and they all went to Central Park together. The city was quieter in the snow, softer, like the world had gentled just for them. Josephine showed the girls how to catch snowflakes on their tongues, how to make snow angels, how to pack snow just right for building. Andrew helped them build a snowman, a lopsided, imperfect snowman with stick arms and a carrot nose. And as he stood back watching his daughters laugh and play, something settled inside him. They were going to be okay. Not because the pain was gone, not because they'd forgotten Sarah, but because they'd learned to carry it together, to let love in again, to trust that broken things could still become beautiful. That evening, walking home through the snow-covered streets, Ella reached up and took his hand. Then Lily took the other one. Chloe walked ahead with Josephine, chattering about the snowman they'd built. And Andrew thought about how far they'd come, from silence to laughter, from emptiness to fullness, from 3 separate pieces to a family. It wasn't the family he'd imagined, but it was the family they needed. That night, tucking the girls into bed, Andrew lingered a little longer than usual, watching them sleep, peaceful, present, here. Tomorrow, they were planning to go back to Central Park, to their favorite spot near Bow Bridge, to have a picnic, even though it was cold. Something felt different about tomorrow, like something was coming, something they'd all been waiting for. Andrew just didn't know what yet. The next day was warmer than it should have been for December. The sun broke through the clouds like grace itself. They packed a simple picnic, sandwiches, fruit, cookies Josephine had baked that morning, and walked to Central Park together. Their spot near Bow Bridge was quiet, peaceful, the kind of place that makes you believe in new beginnings. The girls ran ahead, chasing pigeons, their laughter echoing across the water. Andrew and Josephine spread out the blanket and sat down, watching them play. They're really back, aren't they? Andrew said softly. They never left, Josephine replied. They were just waiting for someone to meet them where they were. They ate lunch together, the girls talking non-stop, their words tumbling over each other in the way only children can manage. After they finished, Lily grew quiet. She stood up from the blanket and walked over to Andrew. She looked at him for a long moment, really looked at him, like she was seeing him clearly for the first time. And then she said it. I love you, Daddy. Clear, strong, true. Andrew's breath caught. Time stopped. Then Chloe came over, stood beside her sister. I love you, Daddy. And Ella, not wanting to be left out, rushed over too. I love you, Daddy. One by one, like gifts unwrapping. Andrew pulled all 3 of them into his arms and held them so tight he thought his heart might burst. I love you too, he whispered, his voice breaking. So much, more than you'll ever know. He looked up at Josephine through his tears. She was watching them, her hand pressed to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She reached into her bag and pulled out the photo of Grace, held it close. "Thank you, Grace," she whispered. "Thank you, Sarah. They're going to be okay now. We all are." 3 months later, on a cold February afternoon, Andrew was walking the girls home from school. They passed a homeless veteran sitting outside a coffee shop near Union Square. His sign said, "Hungry. Anything helps. God bless our troops." Most people walked right past without looking. Andrew started to do the same. Old habit. But Ella stopped, pulled on his coat. "Daddy, wait." She opened her backpack and pulled out her snack, graham crackers, and an apple her teacher had given her. And without hesitation, she walked over to the man and held it out. "You look hungry," she said simply. The veteran's face crumbled, his eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, little angel. Thank you so much." Ella smiled and ran back to Andrew. "He was sad, Daddy," she said, taking his hand. "Now, he's not." Andrew knelt down, his heart so full he could barely speak. He looked at all 3 of his daughters, these beautiful, compassionate, healed little girls. They'd learned to see. Not just look, but see. The invisible people, the ones everyone walks past, the ones who hold more grace than the world gives them credit for. They learned it from Josephine, and now they'd carry it forward. Walking home, the girls chattering about their day, Andrew thought about 18 months ago, the silence, the darkness, the crushing weight of believing he'd lost them forever. And he thought about a 75-year-old homeless woman sitting on a sidewalk, the one everyone ignored, the one who held the key to everything. Grace doesn't arrive in expensive packages. It doesn't come with credentials or contracts. Sometimes it shows up in worn jackets and weathered hands, in quiet smiles and patient love, in people the world has forgotten, but God never does. That evening, they all sat around the dinner table, Andrew, the girls, Josephine, and said grace together before eating. The girls reached for each other's hands naturally, a chain of love. "Thank you for this food," Lily said. "And for our family," Chloe added. "And for Joe," Ella finished. "We love you, Joe." Josephine smiled, her eyes bright. "I love you too, sweethearts, more than you know." After dinner, Andrew stood at the window watching the city lights flicker to life. Behind him, he could hear his daughters laughing, could hear Josephine reading them a story, could hear life happening the way it was always meant to. Healing doesn't happen in boardrooms or therapy sessions. It happens in kitchens and parks and sidewalks, in the small moments when love shows up without asking for anything in return. Some things can't be bought. Some wounds can only be healed by grace. And sometimes the people we overlook are the ones sent to save us. Andrew turned from the window and walked back to his family. Complete, healed, home,